And that is a very simple way. It's the word and, A-N-D, the Catholic and. Protect human life and dignity. Defend human rights and responsibilities. Stand up for family and community. Exercise a priority for the poor and those who are vulnerable. Defend the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Stand up for solidarity and practice subsidiarity. And care for the planet, care for creation, and for the poorest people on that planet. And if you put all those ands together, we call that the common good. These are the ideas that give us a different way of looking at the world. And they call us to look at the world from the bottom up. How does it touch the least of these? The poor, the vulnerable, the defenseless. So we have a framework that others would die for. I work with a lot of evangelicals. They think, I remember one evangelical black pastor said, he says in the black church, he says, we sing with more fire than you do. And frankly, judging by our parish, that wouldn't take much. He says, we preach with more passion than you do. I'm sure that's not true here, but in my parish, that's true. He says, but you think a lot more clearly than we do. Do you know what you have? Do you own it? Do you use it? Secondly, it's not just what we believe that matters, it's what we do. Think about it. Who shelters the homeless? Who cares for the sick? Who educates the young? The other night, Linda and I went into the local grocery store. It only took us about 15 minutes circling around to find it. And as we're checking out with soda and, deodorant and all sorts of important things, there was a bin. It's food for the hungry. Christ the King Parish. Who collects food for the hungry? Who cares for the poor and vulnerable here on the Cape? So it's not just what we believe that matters, it's what we do. There are a lot of us. The scriptures say without a people, without a vision, the people perish. It's also true, without a people, the vision is invisible. There are 67 million Catholics? It's a terrible thing, but only a third of us go to Mass on any given Sunday. That's lousy. But if you think about it in a different way, I think that means there's 25 million people in church every weekend. What would NBC News give for that? What would MoveOn.org give for that? What would Promise Keepers give for that? If we put together our ideas, our experience, our leaders, like your pastors and our Holy Father, and our people, we could change the world. A friend of mine, as an organizer, said, if you ever got your act together, you'd be dangerous. Well, how do we put our act together? Well, one of the things we do is we do not divide what we believe from how we live. This is the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. And this is one of the most important sentences. It says, Christians are citizens of two cities, and we try and live out our earthly lives in response to the gospel. And the split between what we believe as Christians and how we act in everyday life is one of the worst errors of our time. We need to put together what we believe and how we act. And so here is my advice, and I'll close with this. And I'm very anxious here. I give lots of talks, but rarely is my wife in the audience. And so I make up stories, I don't. But when it comes to theory, she thinks I'm pretty good. When it comes to strategy, what do we do? Okay. When it comes to what are we going to do today, like where are we going to dinner last night? I'll spare you that. A little shaky. It reminds me of a story, it's one of those airplane stories, you've probably heard this. In airplane is the president, the vice president, a priest, let's make him a Monsignor, and a Boy Scout. No Monsignor in particular. Somehow the pilots come back and they say, with all this Homeland Security, I don't know how this happened, but this airplane is going down and we have 3 parachutes for the 4 of you. The president says, I was just reelected. I'm not going down with this plane. Out he goes. Vice President Biden says, I'm the most experienced, sophisticated, smartest vice president in the history of the world. I was reelected too. The Monsignor says, if you don't stop talking, none of us are going to make it out of here. He says, that man needs me, pointing to the door, and he grabs one and out he goes. And the Monsignor turns to the Boy Scout and says, son, I've lived a long life. I'm ready to meet the Lord. I'm in the state of grace. And the Boy Scout says, Father, I don't know what the state of grace is, but I know this. The smartest, savviest vice president in history just took my knapsack out that door. Well, for the advice I'm about to give, I feel like I'm jumping only with a knapsack. We need to integrate, not isolate, our social mission. As I said, it's not something the pastor just does for us. A couple of really good people do for the rest of us. A committee does. This belongs to all of us. And if we're not taking this mission seriously, we're not fully and completely Catholic. Secondly, we need to very much anchor this mission in prayer. This is the work of the church. This is following Jesus. This is not politics. This is not ideology. This is caring for the least of these. Our very salvation depends upon it. There's only one story, the Last Judgment. There's only one question. What did you do for the least of these? We need to share the good news. We need to share the secret of our social teaching. I find people in Congress, people in the Pentagon, people in other faiths look to our church because we've been thinking about these ideas for a long time. But we don't own it ourselves like we should. So we need to share the secret, and something like tonight is a good example, but it needs to be more than that. We need to continue to serve the least of these, to collect food, to care for the homeless, to take care of the grieving, to take care of the people with addiction and mental illness, to stand with people who feel alone and subject to discrimination, to defend the dignity of immigrants. We do that. We need to promote everyday Christianity, and by that I mean it's sort of like the Pope talks about good enough Christians. It's not just good enough that we go to Mass on the weekend, that we try and raise our kids in the faith, that we make a gift every Sunday. It's how do we live? What kind of worker are we? What kind of investor are we? What kind of grandparent or parent are we? How do we teach? Are we members of the community association? Do we join Bread for the World or Right to Life? How do we stand up for the poor, the vulnerable, the unborn, and the undocumented? How does our worship on Sunday and Saturday affect our work and our life the rest of the week? And then we're called to be faithful citizens. And this makes people nervous. They say, don't you know we have an amendment, keep church and state separate? I think they mostly want us to be quiet when they talk about that. But because there's so much anxiety, I always try and explain what faithful citizenship it is not. It is not about the religious practices of politicians. It's not about whether they sing in the choir, whether they go to church every Sunday, whether they've been born again. I've been at this so long, I remember President Reagan talked about God all the time and never went to church. President Clinton went to church all the time and seemed to have missed one or two of the commandments. So it's not their own religious behavior. It's not about the political clout of religious groups. Many Catholics used to be predictably Democrat. You probably heard the story of Mrs. O'Reilly in Chicago. She's very upset. Her son had not only moved to the suburb, he had become a Republican. And they were fighting on election day. And he turned to his mother and said, if Jesus Christ himself came back as a Republican, you wouldn't vote for him. And she said, well, why would he change his party affiliation after all these years? Well, that may be true for Mrs. O'Reilly, but it's not true for the rest of us. In many ways, we're up for grabs. And it's not about our pastors or our bishops telling us how to vote. The most countercultural thing our church teaches us in some ways is not that all life is sacred. It's not that the poor ought to come first or the war ought to be a last resort, although those are countercultural. It's not that we ought to not solve our problems with violence, whether it's abortion or assisted suicide, as you faced in this state, or the death penalty. In some ways, the most countercultural thing our church teaches us is that politics is a good thing, and we belong in it. We ought to get involved. I ran for office when I was 24 years old, and I lost. One of the best things that ever happened to me. There are worse things than standing up for what you believe and losing an election. One Sunday, our daughter Kelly came out of Mass and said that she thought she would run for office. She did not like the choices that were available to her. And I thought this was just terrific. She had gotten the message. She would stand up for the right things. Linda had a somewhat different reaction. She said, maybe you ought to register to vote first. Well, we have a lot of Catholics who don't vote. We have a lot of Catholics who don't run. And it's not just electoral politics. It's how do we stand up in our community association? How do we stand up in towns and cities and states? The Holy Father, in this case Benedict, said it is the church's responsibility to help form our consciences so we might act differently to defend the weak and the vulnerable, to work for justice, even when this involves neglecting our own interests. Probably the best way to describe the action of the whole community, not individuals, is we ought to be political without being partisan. We should not be chaplain or cheerleader for any particular party or candidate. We ought to be principled but not ideological. We shouldn't compromise on the defense of human life or the priority for the poor, but we ought to work with people of different perspectives on how to accomplish those things. We ought to be civil but not soft. We ought to be clear about our principles, but we shouldn't call people names. We shouldn't impugn their motives. And we ought to be engaged but not used. We ought to be involved, but in ways that advance our values and not get used by those who want to give lip service to who we are, but not to what we believe. There are examples, and maybe in the question period we can go into this. Two examples right now are this effort to define what is a religious ministry in a way that would exclude many of the Catholic ministries of healthcare and human services. That's not up to the government. We believe because we are Catholic, we are called to serve those in need. And so when the Department of Health and Human Services, when the White House, when the courts, when the Congress tell us, we'll decide what's religious and what's not, we have to stand up and say, no, you won't. That belongs to us. The Circle of Protection is an effort across the Christian community to say at a time of budget scarcity, we should not balance the budget on the backs of the poor and vulnerable. The poor ought to come first before some of the rest of us who are more affluent. We can talk about that later. The dangers, one danger is we don't practice what we preach. We're guilty of hypocrisy. We proclaim one thing and live another way. A big danger is polarization, where the divisions in politics begin to get reflected inside our parishes. My view is we can divide up the work, but we shouldn't divide up the church. We can't have the pro-lifers over here and the social justice folks here, and people concerned about immigration here, and people concerned about marriage over here, and we belong together and we ought to act like it. Righteousness is a danger. In the Bible, it's a virtue, but not the way I practice it. I am never worse than when I'm sure I'm really right. And some of you probably have the same problem. The biggest problem, the biggest danger, is to say this is not my job. I'm not an activist. I just go to church on Sunday. I mean, I didn't sign up for some political program. No believer, no leader, no member of these parishes can say that bringing good news to the poor and liberty to captives is not part of our job. I'm going to skip that. Over the weekend, Pope Francis wrote a letter to the leaders of all the democracies of the world that I think summarize this. The goal of economics and politics is to serve humanity, beginning with the poorest and most vulnerable, wherever they may be, even in their mother's wombs. Every economic and political theory must set about providing each inhabitant of the planet, every person, with the minimum so that they can live in dignity and freedom, so they can support a family, educate children, praise God, and develop their potential. That's the goal of all of economic and political life. That's what we're called to be as salt and light and leaven. Let me conclude with a story. I was giving a talk to a bunch of business leaders in upstate New York, Catholics. And I thought the talk had gone rather well. I outlined some of these principles we discussed. And people were very gracious and kind, except one guy was really upset. And unfortunately, he was the president of the group, and unfortunately, I was seated next to him. And I could tell he was angry, and I said, "What's wrong? You seem upset." He said, "You don't want to know." And by then, I didn't want to know, but I was sort of in too far. I said, "No, what's the problem?" He says, "I'm tired of all this talk about the poor, the vulnerable, the unborn, the undocumented. What about me? What about people like me who work hard, pay the bills, use my envelope every Sunday? Is there anything in those encyclicals, those statements for me?" And I responded with great eloquence. I talked about Mother Teresa, I talked about the popes, I quoted Jesus. I got nowhere. Finally, I said, "What do you do for a living?" And in this case, he was a lawyer. And I said, "Well, you said you work really hard." He says, "When you're working late, do you ever come across the person who cleans your office?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Well, tell me about that person." He said, "Well, I don't know much about her. It's a woman, she's an immigrant, she's been with us a while, she's from Latin America, that's about all I know." I said, what do you pay her?" He said, "Well, we don't really pay her. We hire a company, they hire her." I said, "Come on, what does she get paid for cleaning your office?" He said, "What do you mean?" "She scrubs the toilet, she mops the floor, she dusts the desk. What does she get as a wage for doing that?" And he says, "Well, probably minimum wage." I said, "Does your firm have a health plan?" He says, "Yes, a good one. Covers families." I said, "Does a woman who cleans your office, is she part of your plan?" He said, "No, I told you. We hire them, they hire her." And he said, "What are you getting at?" And I said, "Well, what I'm getting at in the end, it's not about politics. It's not about ideology. This is about whether the woman who cleans your office, whether she and her husband can raise their kids in dignity, whether she can take her kids to the doctor when they get sick." And he looked at me and said, "Well, why didn't you say so?" I think part of our task as Catholics, as Christians, is to share the good news of the gospel so that none of us can ever say, why didn't you say so? Thank you very much.
He mentioned Linda several times. I'm not sure where she is. Why don't you stand up? We can welcome you to the Cape as well. This is John's wife. John has agreed to do a short Q&A. Remember, for those of you who have been here before, this is forbidden land, because there are all sorts of cords and stuff. So if you're on that side of the room, please go around and come up here. And the way that this is set up tonight is a little different. Why don't you ask your question and then go back to your place to listen to John. Otherwise, he's going to be turning to the questionnaire, I think. And I'll make sure the microphone goes off after the question is asked. So is anybody a comment or a question that they want to offer? Go on.
Thank you very much. When I read the program for tonight, I read about social ministry and the key elements of the Catholic mission in public life. And I must admit, I misunderstood that. I was thinking of Catholics in public life, our senators, our congressmen. And it's disturbing to think about some of these people. And I have in mind our wonderful late Senator Kennedy and our former Senator Kerry, both of whom are pro-choice. And in the past, it seems that other politicians have been denied by the church, have denied things like the Eucharist. Some have been threatened with excommunication. But my point being, I guess, you're telling us how we should try to act as Catholics in public life. And we have these role models who make it extremely difficult. Non-Catholics especially ask us these probing questions of how come you think this way, our leaders think that way. Could you comment?
Glad we're starting with an easy one. A couple things. One, I'll explain what the attitude of the Bishops' Conference is towards penalties in this regard. You mentioned that in some cases people in public life have been denied communion or threatened with excommunication. While I respect those bishops who have taken that path, there are really very, very, very few of them. The vast majority of our bishops have taken the position that the sacraments are not the place for these kind of battles. The public arena is. And in fact, Pope Francis actually gave an example early in his leadership where he was talking to a group of priests, and he said, it's a little bit different, but I think the same point applies, where he said if a couple comes to marry, we start asking them a lot of questions on whether they're eligible or qualified to marry, instead of welcoming them and celebrating the sacrament. When a single mother comes to have her child baptized, we question her whether she's lived a good life, rather than welcoming this child in the family of faith. I don't think there is anyone in America who doubts where the Catholic Church is on matters of life. I don't think there's any politician, I don't think there's any journalist, I don't think there's anybody in the world. So there's not a problem with what we teach. There is a problem that we have not persuaded people, including members of our own faith, to act in accord with that. My own view is that's not only on the bishops, that's on us. In that if more of us said, Senator Kennedy was once pro-life, if more of us said, I want a senator who's pro-life, and that's really important to me, I think that would have had an impact. I think the problem And the solution doesn't lie with who gets the sacraments or not. I think the problem and the solution lies with what do we stand up for in public life and say is important to us. We also have, candidly, politicians who simply ignore the church's teaching on concern for the poor. It's of a different kind. It's not as clear in some ways, but it's just as compelling. The child dying of hunger in Africa also has a claim on our consciences. So my own view is we have a lot of work to do, and that most of the work has to be done by people like us saying we want our leaders to reflect our values, and that the imposition of penalties, in my experience, I don't know, there are not any journalists here, often is counterproductive. We turn people who fail to follow our teaching into heroes for resisting the authority of the church. So Cardinal Wuerl, Cardinal O'Malley, your own bishop, I think, take the right course in standing up as clearly as they can for what they believe, so that there can be no confusion about where the church stands. Other questions?
Thank you. It's my understanding that in order to make our political beliefs more palatable to countries that are abusing human rights, that the whole definition of freedom of religion has been changed somewhat to that you can have faith, but not necessarily that you're guaranteed practice of faith. Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm correct in assuming that's true, and that I know Mrs. Clinton has been taking that message abroad, what implications do you see for that? Thank you.
I think there is a real debate on the definition of freedom of religion. Some, particularly more repressive regimes around the world, would say it's only a matter of freedom of worship. You can gather amongst yourself, you can pray to your God, and we'll not interfere with that as long as you don't interfere with anything that affects the larger community. Some places deny even that. Saudi Arabia doesn't permit any Christian worship. In China, only approved churches can gather for worship in some provinces. There is a long-standing debate about our position, which is it's not only freedom of worship, but freedom to live your faith. For example, we believe our faith calls us to educate the young and to care for the sick and to care for those who are poor and vulnerable. We view that as a religious duty, not a social option. And we have to be clear that we believe that belongs to religious communities regardless of what country they're in. I think it's a little unfair to say that Secretary Clinton made that case around the world. There has been a series of disputes, and in fact, in the case of Secretary Clinton, she intervened to make sure that Catholic Relief Services, which does wonderful work around the world, especially in Africa, in terms of treating those people with HIV/AIDS, could continue to do so consistent with our values and our beliefs. So I think this is something we need to be very vigilant about. My view is that the issues of religious freedom should neither be minimized, which is the temptation of some people, or exaggerated. There's a real struggle going on, and we have to make sure our voices are heard. That for us, faith is not a Sunday thing, it's not a sanctuary thing, it's a way of life. And to have freedom of religion is to be able to carry out your faith in life. And so, to their credit, frankly, the U.S. government has gotten better at standing up for freedom of religion over the last 15 or 20 years. We want that to continue, not to pull back. one of the things we did was we worked for a piece of legislation where the State Department had to report on religious liberty in every country on earth, the status of religious liberty. The second thing we did was we passed a bill that said that people who represent us abroad, our ambassadors and foreign service people, had to be better trained in what faith is and what it means. When I was working with Monsignor Hoy, he was about 12 years old and I was about 8 years old. The church in El Salvador was under terrible trouble, and Cardinal Hickey had been a part of sending a group of religious women there who were killed by the government, the army. And one of our people in the government said they weren't practicing religion, they were practicing Marxism by feeding the poor. Half a world away, Lech Walesa was standing up for the rights of workers and changing the world. And that was a matter of faith. And so it cuts in many different directions, but one of the things we've worked on through the years is to make sure those who represent our country abroad are more understanding and more knowledgeable about how faith plays a constructive role in society.
Just a quick question. Could you speak a little bit more about solidarity and subsidiarity?
Sure. One of the problems with Catholic social teaching is we have our own jargon, and it pushes people away instead of pulling people in. I always used to say with some of my friends, there are a special set of words: constitutive, marginal, paradigm. And, you know, I said constitutive sounded like you might have some intestinal problems, you know, and marginal involved butter of some kind, you know. And anyway, solidarity was really what John Paul II was all about. He insisted wherever he went in the world, we are our brothers and sisters keepers. We are members of one human family. It was not just a union in Poland, it was a way of thinking about ourselves. And it's the idea that we are all children of God and have ties together. And solidarity begins with the protection of the weakest and most vulnerable. But it is a core of the church's teaching. Subsidiarity is about how you exercise. Solidarity is about relationships. And it works two ways. One is the smallest institutions in society, the family, for example, should not be interfered with by larger institutions in carrying out its roles. Likewise, the neighborhood or the community or the state, up to the federal government. That's one way, protecting the small institutions from interference by larger structures. It also works the other way. When small institutions can't meet their needs or can't protect rights, they have a duty, in fact, to call on larger institutions to do so. For me, a very practical example was, remember when Katrina happened? Terrible things. We saw on TV those people on houses in the Superdome. Everybody said that's not right. People shouldn't be treated that way. And my bet is every parish on Cape Cod, every school on Cape Cod did something. They said, we've got to help those people. They're members of our family. We're going to do something. That was solidarity. Subsidiarity, the failure of subsidiarity was that the local government couldn't handle things. The buses stood there, and the state government screwed up too. And eventually, we called on the federal government to help. We brought in the military, and eventually we provided resources. Subsidiarity is not in the word check, the spell check for either word or word perfect. So we have some work to do. But one insists we are members of one human family, and the other principle which works with it has to do with how we respond to the needs of other members of the human family. One of the best things we did when I was a member of the conference was there was this great pastoral letter on economic life, 140 pages, I think 160 footnotes. It really was a remarkable summary of Catholic teaching. And one of the bishops raised his hand and he said, you know, if we could fit this, he said, I agree with everything that's in here. If we could fit this on the back of a holy card, we'd really have something. And guess what? There is a holy card version of Catholic social teaching. 7 principles, 1 paragraph each. I'm sure you either have them or we can get them to you. And there are ways where you can read volumes on this, and you can have a card which summarizes it. So we have work to do.
I want to thank you very much, John. And we do have some coffee and something that's hidden underneath those tinfoil. I saw somebody had the folder. What's the date of the next talk? July 16? Okay. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot.